What happens when power, prejudice, and identity collide with the wrong target? A single encounter, a split-second judgment, unraveling everything in ways no one could have imagined. This is the story of a fateful moment that changes everything. Olivia Chambers stood motionless in the blazing heat of the afternoon, the sun beating down on her as sweat trickled down her forehead, stinging her eyes. The black SUV in front of her seemed to mock her as the driver's side door hung wide open, its emptiness a stark reminder of the chaos unfolding around her. Her fingers worked frantically, rifling through the scattered papers and crumpled receipts strewn across the front seat. The search was becoming a blur. Where is it? Her thoughts raced. Come on, come on! Her pulse quickened as the weight of the situation began to settle in. She was already running late when she pulled into the lot, but now the missing handbag threatened to ruin everything. Her phone buzzed again. Another call from the office. Its persistent vibrate a cruel reminder of the ticking clock. She didn't even glance at it. Not now. Her heart was consumed with only one thing, finding that handbag. Her wallet, her ID, everything that made her, well, her. A low hum caught her attention, drawing her eyes up just in time to see a police cruiser slowly creeping through the lot. The officer behind the wheel locked eyes with her. She quickly turned back to the car, her pulse spiking. She didn't have time for this, but she could feel his gaze lingering, following her every move. The cruiser rolled to a stop, the engine dying with an almost deliberate slowness. The door opened with a heavy thud, boots slamming against the hot asphalt. "Hey!" The voice was gruff, demanding. Olivia's body tensed as her fingers froze on the car seat, her heart now pounding in her throat. She knew what was coming. She had been dreading it, but there was no escaping it. Slowly she straightened up, taking a deep, steadying breath, preparing for what she had to do next. Turning, she faced the officer, a man in his mid-40s, his face hard and unforgiving. His eyes were sharp, cutting through her with a look that spoke of years of judgment and suspicion. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid, but it was the way his hand rested on his belt, casually, as though daring her to make a wrong move that made her feel small. "What do you think you're doing?" The words cut through the air, sharp and commanding. Olivia wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, forcing herself to stand her ground. "I'm just looking for my handbag," she said, her voice steady but strained. "I misplaced it somewhere in the car." His eyes narrowed even further, the suspicion now turning to something darker. "You got ID on you?" His gaze never left her, his posture not shifting an inch. Olivia's stomach churned, but she refused to flinch. "I told you," she said, gesturing toward the car. "I lost my handbag. I'm late for a meeting, and I just need to find it." The officer's lip curled into a sneer. "Late for a meeting, huh?" he mocked. "Step away from the vehicle." Olivia fought the urge to snap. This wasn't the time to escalate things. Slowly she stepped back, raising her hand slightly as a silent gesture of peace. "This is my car," she repeated, her voice now firm but with a layer of quiet frustration. "I just need to find my handbag, and I'll be out of here." But the officer wasn't listening. His eyes locked on her, the mixture of suspicion and something colder still clouding his expression. He moved closer, his stance growing more threatening. "Lady, you're acting real suspicious," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You expect me to believe you just lost your handbag in this car?" He scanned the SUV, his gaze sharp, as though looking for evidence of a crime. Olivia's patience was beginning to crack, the weight of his relentless stare wearing her down. She exhaled slowly, her voice steady, but now filled with the sharp edge of irritation. "Yes," she said, meeting his eyes head-on. "It's my car!" She had no choice but to search for them, her mind running through 100 possibilities. The officer watched her intently, his expression skeptical. "Keys, huh?" he remarked, a hint of mockery in his voice. "You got any proof of that? Because right now all I see is someone tampering with the car." Olivia felt the sting of his words, tightening her jaw. This was not the moment for a misunderstanding, but especially not today. "My ID is in my purse," she responded, keeping her frustration at bay. The officer moved closer, hand resting on his weapon. "Sure, step back from the vehicle," he demanded. Olivia froze for a moment, then realized the precariousness of the situation. She was a black woman, alone in a parking lot, digging through an SUV without ID. She understood how she might be perceived by someone like this officer, and arguing could only make it worse. With a deep breath, she moved away from the car door, trying to stay calm. Her mind raced. This could escalate quickly. She had no choice but to search for her handbag, her mind running through 100 possibilities. The officer watched her intently, his expression skeptical. "You got proof of that?" he remarked, a hint of mockery in his voice. "Because right now, all I see is someone tampering with a car." Olivia felt the sting of his words, tightening her jaw. This was not the moment for a misunderstanding, but especially not today. "My ID is in my handbag," she responded, keeping her frustration at bay. The officer moved closer, hand resting on his weapon. "Sure, step back from the vehicle," he demanded. Olivia froze for a moment, then realized the precariousness of the situation. She was a black woman, alone in a parking lot, digging through an SUV without ID. She understood how she might be perceived by someone like this officer, and arguing could only make it worse. With a deep breath, she moved away from the car door, trying to stay calm. Her mind raced. This could escalate quickly. She wasn't afraid, but she wasn't naive. The officer seemed to interpret her hesitation as guilt, circling the vehicle as if searching for something to use against her. "Hands where I can see them," he ordered, pulling out handcuffs. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. "What? Are you serious? I told you, it's my car!" The officer ignored her, reaching for her arm, snapping the cuffs in place. "You're under arrest," he said coldly. "Suspicion of car theft." Her mind was reeling. Her keys were somewhere in that vehicle, but somehow she was the one being treated as a criminal. As he led her to the patrol car, Olivia took one last look at her car, a feeling of helpless anger bubbling inside her. This wasn't over. The back seat of the police car was uncomfortable, the stale air heavy with the smell of sweat and frustration. As she sat there, wrists still cuffed, she watched through the window. Officer Caleb Foster was inspecting her SUV, flashlight in hand. His gaze sharpened with suspicion, his earlier doubt only increasing. Around her, the parking lot was quiet. A few people had passed by, glancing at her with discomfort but doing nothing to intervene. No one even questioned what was happening. The door to the car swung open, and Caleb appeared again, his face grim. He yanked her out of the car. "No ID?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "I told you," Olivia said, her voice composed but tight. "My handbag is in the car. If you just let me grab it, I'll show you everything." Ignoring her completely, Caleb shook his head. "You expect me to believe you're just some honest citizen who misplaced her handbag? No way. You're stealing this car." Olivia inhaled deeply, trying to keep her temper in check. "Look, officer," she said, speaking slowly. "I'm the state attorney. That's my car. If you'd run a background check or check the registration, you'd see everything's in order." Caleb snorted in disbelief. "State attorney? You're joking, right? People like you don't get those kinds of jobs." He leaned in closer, sneering. "Stop lying, and maybe this will go easier for you." Olivia felt her chest tighten with frustration. "People like me?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Caleb ignored the question. "You're making this difficult for no reason. You should have thought of a better story, state attorney." He scoffed. "I've heard worse, but this is a new low." Olivia's patience was running thin. She had spent years breaking down barriers, fighting against every judgment people like Caleb made about her because of the color of her skin. Now, standing here, handcuffed, facing someone who wouldn't even listen, it was all coming to a boil. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "Oh, it's ridiculous, all right," Caleb sneered. He stepped back and waved another officer over. "You think you can just waltz in here and steal a car because you've got some fancy job title? Think again." Olivia shook her head, stunned. "I'm telling you the truth. Why won't you just check the plates?" Caleb shot her an irritated look. "Why? So you can buy yourself more time? I know your type. Probably got a record, thinking you're smarter than me." "You're not." Olivia bit her lip, keeping the retort in. She knew arguing with someone like Caleb was a lost cause. Still, each word from his mouth was another slap in the face. Olivia could feel the officer's gaze cutting right through her. He wasn't even pretending to care about the truth. He had already decided who she was. Officer Jacob Turner appeared beside him, clipboard in hand, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding. "Everything okay here?" he asked, glancing from Olivia to Mulligan. Caleb waved him off like it was nothing. "Just a routine arrest. She's got some story about being the state attorney, but no ID. Booking her for attempted car theft." Olivia's jaw clenched as the cuffs bit into her wrists. "You haven't even checked the plates!" she shot back, her voice tight with frustration. Caleb didn't even flinch. "Enough talking," he growled, his voice low and dangerous, "or I'll make sure you regret it." Olivia held back the retort that burned in her chest. She wasn't stupid, arguing wouldn't help. She just had to ride this out. But every second stretched her patience thin. It was clear they weren't seeing her for who she was. Just another black woman to suspect. Just another criminal in their eyes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Caleb broke the silence. "We'll figure this out when we get to the station," he said with finality. Olivia didn't argue. There was no point. She let out a slow breath, the sound of the patrol car door slamming behind her like a final nail in the coffin. She wasn't about to back down, but damn if she wasn't tired of this. The truth would come out. It had to. But that didn't make the injustice sting any less. The car hummed on and Olivia stared out the window, her thoughts racing. She wondered how many others had been here before. People with no power, no name to clear their reputation. People silenced before they could even speak. She knew one thing for sure. When this was over, things were going to change. The holding cell felt like an icebox. Her wrists throbbed where the cuffs dug in, and the station buzzed with the low hum of activity. Officers shuffled past, phones rang, and the dull murmur of conversations echoed around her. This wasn't where she was supposed to be. She'd spent years fighting to get where she was, just to be thrown in a cage like everyone else. She shifted uncomfortably, her mind replaying every moment. The way Caleb had ignored her, dismissed her. He hadn't checked the plates, hadn't run her name. She was locked up based on nothing but his assumptions. Across the room, Caleb was scribbling something on a piece of paper, muttering to another officer. No urgency, no sense of a mistake, just another case, another black woman in cuffs. Olivia took a breath, then called out, "Can you at least take these cuffs off? This is ridiculous." Caleb didn't even look up. "Sit tight. We'll get to that when we're ready," he said, dripping sarcasm with every word. Her frustration boiled over. She wasn't some scared kid to be bullied into silence, but she knew better than to engage with him. He wasn't listening. He had already decided. After what felt like forever, Caleb sauntered over to her, a smug look on his face. "All right, state attorney," he sneered. "You ready to admit you were lying?" Olivia met his gaze, unwavering. "I've told you from the start, I'm the state attorney, and you've made a huge mistake, but you're too wrapped up in your bias to see it." Caleb chuckled, leaning closer. "Bias? Lady, this isn't about bias. It's about you being suspicious, making excuses. I hear it all the time. You're not special." Olivia took a deep breath, trying to keep it together. "If you just checked the plates or ran a background check, you'd see it's all in order. This could have been over by now." Caleb shook his head, completely dismissing her. "Nah, you don't get to tell me how to do my job. You criminals always think you know better. Lucky I haven't charged you for resisting." Olivia didn't flinch. She'd had enough of arguing with him. There was no point. But she knew, deep down, that when this was all over, it would be him who regretted it. Officer Jacober walked over, handing Caleb a clipboard. He glanced at it and handed it back without a second thought. "What about her?" Officer Jacober asked, clearly uneasy. "Shouldn't she get her call now?" Caleb dismissed him with a wave. "She'll get her call when I say she gets it," he muttered, turning away. "What's she gonna do, call the mayor?" He snickered, clearly enjoying his own joke. Olivia's anger simmered quietly beneath the surface. She knew the procedure. She knew this was wrong. But Caleb didn't care. It wasn't about procedure. It was about control. And for now, he had the power. Olivia knew one thing for sure. Caleb wasn't here for justice. It was all about control. And right now, he was soaking up every moment of it. A moment later, another officer walked in, a seasoned man with a weary face. His gaze swept the room, landing on Olivia for just a split second. She could see it. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but it was quickly erased, replaced by indifference as he turned to Caleb. "What's going on with her?" the officer asked, his voice a gravelly mix of curiosity and fatigue. Caleb turned, his posture still relaxed, still oozing that smug confidence. "Just another case of someone who thinks they're above the law," he said, dismissing the situation with a wave. "She says she's the state attorney. Can you believe that?" The older officer raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting back to Olivia. "State attorney, huh?" He studied her for a moment, weighing his next move carefully. "Might be a good idea to run those plates," he suggested, his tone neutral, as if trying to break through Mulligan's arrogance. Caleb snorted, dismissing him with a casual flick of his hand. "I'll get around to it," he muttered. Olivia locked eyes with the older officer, silently pleading for him to act. But after a long beat, he simply turned on his heel and walked back to his desk, leaving her where she was. Still handcuffed, still disbelieved, still ignored. A wave of frustration surged in her chest, but she swallowed it down. She needed a way out, a way to make them see reason. She needed that phone call. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Caleb swaggered back over, his grin as wide as ever. "All right, princess," he taunted. "You want your phone call? You got it. Let's see who you can pull strings with." Olivia didn't respond. She stood up, wincing as she flexed her sore wrists, and walked toward the phone. Her mind raced, but she kept her movements calm, her anger simmering beneath the surface. She had to keep it together. This wasn't over. The phone sat on a small, worn-out desk in the corner of the room. It was an old landline, the kind she hadn't used in years, but it was her lifeline now. As she walked toward it, Caleb leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her with that same mocking smirk. "Make it quick," he called out. "Wouldn't want you wasting any more of our time." Ignoring him, she picked up the receiver and dialed the number she knew by heart. It rang once, twice. Then, a familiar voice broke through the static. "Mark Edwards." "Mark, it's Olivia," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside. There was a brief silence on the other end, and she could almost hear him shift in his chair. "Olivia! Where are you? I've been trying to reach you." "I'm at the police station," she replied, her frustration creeping through despite herself. "I was arrested." Mark's voice went sharp, disbelief evident in every word. "Arrested? For what?" Olivia glanced at Caleb, who was still lounging by the door, his smirk never faltering. "They think I was trying to steal my own car," she said dry. There was a long silence on the other end before Mark let out a heavy sigh. "Which station?" "Central Precinct," Olivia replied, her gaze never leaving Caleb's. "I need you down here now." "I'm on my way," Mark said quickly. "Don't say anything else. I'll handle it." Olivia hung up the phone, gripping the receiver tightly for a moment before gently putting it back. She turned to face Caleb, her jaw tight. "So, who's coming to save you?" he asked, his voice laced with mockery. "Your lawyer?" "Yes," Olivia said simply, her voice steady, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. Caleb pushed off from the wall, a smug look still plastered on his face. Caleb took a step toward Olivia, his eyes narrowing as he looked her over. "You've got quite the attitude for someone in your position," he sneered. "Most people would be grateful to get a phone call, but you think you're special, don't you?" Olivia met his gaze with a cold, unreadable expression. "I don't think I'm special," she replied evenly, her voice steady. "But I do think you're making a mistake." Caleb chuckled, shaking his head. Sure, I'll believe that when I see it." With a final mocking glance, he turned and walked out, leaving Olivia standing alone. She took a slow breath, then sank back into the hard chair, trying to center herself. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But knowing Mark was on his way gave her a sliver of relief. He wasn't just any lawyer, he was one of the best. They had worked together on plenty of cases, and he knew how to handle situations like this. She trusted him completely. Still, the fact that it had come to this was infuriating. She scanned the drab gray walls, the harsh fluorescent lights making the whole room feel even more claustrophobic. It was a place designed to break people, to make them feel small and powerless. But Olivia wasn't like the others. She had spent her career fighting for justice in rooms like this, and she wasn't about to let one arrogant officer break her. Time crawled by, the minutes stretching on like hours. Officers passed by the door occasionally, glancing at her with mild curiosity, but no one bothered to check her background. No one confirmed her identity. It was as if they were content to let her rot there, nameless and forgotten. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door swung open. Mark Edwards walked in, his tall frame filling the doorway. His sharp gray suit was a stark contrast to the grimy surroundings, and his eyes immediately locked on Olivia, a flash of controlled fury in them. "Olivia," he said, his voice low but steady. "Are you all right?" Olivia stood up, meeting his gaze. "I'm fine," she said, her voice tight. "But we need to deal with this now." Mark turned to the officer who had followed him in. "I want to speak to whoever's in charge here, immediately." Officer Jacober shifted uncomfortably, looking toward the hallway. I'll get someone," he mumbled, disappearing as quickly as he'd appeared. Mark turned back to Olivia, his expression hardening with disbelief. "Unbelievable. They didn't even check your ID." "No," Olivia replied, her voice strained with anger. "They arrested me without doing any background check. Just took me in based on Caleb's assumptions." Mark clenched his jaw, his fists visibly tightening at his sides. "This is completely unacceptable." "Don't say anything else, I'll take care of it." It didn't take long before Caleb reappeared, his usual cocky swagger faltering just slightly when he saw Mark standing next to Olivia. He paused in the doorway, sizing Mark up with an appraising look. "You must be the lawyer," Caleb said, his tone still flippant but with an edge of uncertainty now. "That's right," Mark replied smoothly, his voice cutting through the tension. "And I'm here to inform you that you've made a grave mistake. You arrested the state attorney without cause, failed to perform even basic checks, and violated her rights. I'm here to ensure this is rectified immediately." Caleb's smirk wavered, but he quickly regained his composure. "State attorney, huh? That's the story she's sticking to?" he asked, his voice dripping with doubt. Mark took a step forward, his eyes cold and unwavering. "It's not a story, it's a fact. And if you don't take this seriously, you'll be dealing with a lawsuit faster than you can blink." Caleb's face darkened, his arrogance beginning to slip. "You're telling me she's really—" Mark cut him off, his voice sharp as a knife. "She's the state attorney, and you've made a monumental error." For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Olivia saw the first crack in Caleb's confidence. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing between her and Mark, clearly unsure of what to do next. "Well, maybe if she'd told me that sooner," Caleb began, but Mark wasn't having it. "She did," Mark snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "And you didn't listen. Now you're going to fix this, or I'm going straight to the police chief." Caleb froze, the bravado draining from him in an instant. He muttered something under his breath, then turned on his heel and stormed out of the room. Olivia watched him go, her anger still bubbling beneath the surface. She turned to Mark, her expression softening, though it was still taut with tension. "Thank you," she said quietly. Mark nodded, his face briefly softening with concern. "This isn't over yet," he said, his voice low but firm. "Let's make sure they release you properly. Then we'll deal with the rest." Olivia sank back into the chair, her body relaxing just slightly. The truth would come out, she was sure of it. But she also knew this was just the beginning. The damage had been done, and there would be consequences, not the ones Caleb had expected, though. As she sat there, the sterile atmosphere pressing in around her, she felt the anger slowly recede, replaced by the steely resolve that had carried her this far. This fight was far from over. The door creaked open, and Officer Caleb Foster entered, his usual swagger now slightly diminished. He didn't immediately meet Olivia's gaze, instead walking to the corner of the room and leaning against the wall, his arms crossed. His smirk was still there, but it was no longer the confident, smug grin it had been earlier. He was trying, but he couldn't quite hold on to it. A moment later, Mark entered, followed closely by the precinct's Sergeant William Harris, a tall, broad man with graying hair and a weary expression. The Sergeant William Harris moved with authority, his eyes scanning the room as if he already knew something had gone terribly wrong. Olivia straightened, catching his gaze for a brief moment, and he gave a slight nod before turning his attention to Mark. The Sergeant William Harris cleared his throat, his voice firm. "Let's get to the bottom of this," he said. "I've been informed that there's been a serious misunderstanding. Miss Chambers, you've been detained under suspicion of vehicle theft. Is that correct?" "Yes," Olivia replied, her voice calm and controlled. "But I've explained multiple times that I'm the state attorney for this city and this is my vehicle." Officer Caleb refused to check my ID or verify any of my information. The Sergeant William Harris turned to Caleb, his expression hardening. "Caleb, is that true? You didn't check her ID?" Caleb shifted uncomfortably but held his defensive posture. "She said she didn't have her ID. Lost her handbag," he muttered. "I followed protocol based on the situation." Mark stepped forward, his voice steady and commanding. "You didn't follow protocol, Officer Caleb. You failed to run her plates." "You didn't perform any background checks. You ignored every single piece of information she provided, including the fact that she's the state attorney. Instead, you profiled her and escalated a situation that didn't need escalating." Caleb clenched his jaw, his face reddening. "She didn't have proof on her. I can't just take people at their word. We deal with liars all the time." The Sergeant William Harris held up a hand to silence him, his voice stern. "That's enough. The issue isn't whether she had ID on her at the time. It's how you handled this from the start. Did you or did you not verify her identity through any other means?" Caleb's eyes shifted away, clearly uncomfortable. "No," he muttered. Olivia watched the exchange, frustration simmering beneath her calm exterior. She had tried to reason with Caleb. She'd given him every chance to verify her information, but he hadn't cared. Now, he was finally being held accountable. Mark's voice rose slightly, filled with righteous indignation. "And when I arrived, you still refused to acknowledge who she was. You mocked her and dismissed my explanation outright. You're not just negligent, Officer Caleb. You're reckless." The Sergeant William Harris's gaze hardened, his eyes narrowing at Caleb, who had crossed his arms defensively. "You need to learn how to handle these situations properly," the Sergeant William Harris said. "This isn't about catching people in lies. It's about doing your job thoroughly. You didn't do that. And now we've detained the state attorney under false charges." Caleb scowled, but the shift in the room was undeniable. He was no longer in control, and everyone knew it. His voice was quieter now. "I was doing my job," he muttered. Olivia finally spoke, her voice cold and measured. "No, you weren't. You were abusing your power. You saw me and made a judgment without any evidence. You ignored everything I said because you didn't believe someone like me could hold a position like mine." Caleb's eyes snapped to hers, anger flickering across his face, but he remained silent. The Sergeant William Harris sighed, his expression softening as he turned back to Olivia. "Miss Chambers, on behalf of this department, I apologize for the way this was handled. We will release you immediately, and this will be thoroughly reviewed." Olivia's eyes never left Caleb's, her voice unwavering. "I appreciate that, but this isn't over. There will be consequences not just for me, but for every person who has been treated this way and hasn't had the power to fight back." The room went silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The Sergeant William Harris nodded solemnly. "Understood. I'll see to it personally that this is addressed." Mark placed a reassuring hand on Olivia's shoulder as she stood, ready to leave the room. But just before she reached the door, she turned back to Caleb, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "You should have listened when I told you who I was," she said quietly but firmly. "Next time, maybe you'll think twice before you judge someone based on nothing but your own assumptions." Caleb didn't respond, but his jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. It was clear he still couldn't accept the reality of what had just happened, even as the truth stood in front of him. Olivia walked out of the room, Mark by her side, feeling the cold satisfaction that came with knowing justice was, for now, in her hands. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. There were larger battles to fight, and this was just the beginning. "We'll be enforcing mandatory training for all officers to tackle these issues," Olivia said, her gaze still fixed on Caleb. "I'll return once the investigation wraps up, and if it turns out this behavior is part of a bigger problem, rest assured it'll be more than just training." Caleb didn't respond. He just lowered his gaze, his hands clenched tightly. As Olivia made her way out of the room, Chief Nathaniel Brooks stood and accompanied her to the door. "Thank you for bringing this to light, Miss Chambers," he said. "I assure you, this will be handled seriously." Olivia gave a brief nod. "I trust it, Chief." She left the room, head held high. This was far from over, but the first step had been made. Caleb would face the consequences, and the department would have to confront its failures. Olivia knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. As she walked away from the station, the weight of the previous day still lingered. But it was lighter now. She had stood firm, and the truth had come out. She would make sure this injustice wouldn't go unchecked again. The road ahead was long, but Olivia Chambers was ready to walk it. The following day, Olivia walked back into the station with the same sense of determination as before. This time, however, she wasn't alone. Mark Edwards, dressed in his usual sharp gray suit, walked by her side, his presence a silent but strong reminder of the support she had. Today's meeting would again be with Chief Nathaniel Brooks and Caleb. But the atmosphere was more charged now. The investigation had moved swiftly, and the stakes were higher. As they approached the chief's office, Olivia could feel the tension weigh heavily on her. But it didn't shake her. She knocked once before pushing the door open. Inside, Chief Nathaniel Brooks sat at his desk, his expression unreadable. Officer Caleb Foster sat in the corner, looking defeated, his confidence drained by the growing consequences of his actions. Olivia and Mark took their seats across from the chief, their faces steady and composed. Nathaniel nodded to both of them before speaking. "Miss Chambers, Mr. Edwards," he began, his hands folded in front of him. "We've completed the preliminary investigation, and we've reached a decision. Officer Caleb's actions were not only unacceptable, but they also directly violated department protocols. We've decided to terminate his employment, effective immediately." Caleb's face tightened, his hands gripping the arms of the chair, lips pressed into a thin line. He remained silent. There was nothing left to say. Olivia briefly glanced at him, but her focus remained on the chief. "I appreciate the department's seriousness," she said. But firing Caleb, while necessary, doesn't address the underlying issues. Nathaniel nodded slowly. I agree. That's why we're initiating a full department review of our training practices, especially regarding racial profiling and escalation protocols. This won't be a superficial check-the-box exercise. We're bringing in external consultants to ensure every officer understands the severity of situations like this. Olivia leaned forward, her eyes sharp. This is a start, Chief, but I need to be clear. It's about more than just training. It's about changing the culture of how your officers handle situations like mine. It's about making sure people of color aren't automatically labeled as criminals or suspects because they don't fit a certain image. I want to see real change, not just on paper, but in how your officers engage with the community. Nathaniel met her gaze, his expression firm. I understand, Miss Chambers, and I can assure you we're committed to making these changes. This incident has exposed deep flaws in our department, and we won't let it go unaddressed. Olivia studied him, weighing his sincerity. Promises were easy, but follow-through was what mattered. She wasn't looking for more words. She wanted to see action. Mark cleared his throat, cutting through the silence. We'll be closely monitoring the department's progress, he said. And if we find that these changes aren't implemented, we'll be back to ensure accountability is upheld. Nathaniel nodded again, his expression serious. Understood. I'll keep you both updated on our progress. Olivia shifted her attention back to Caleb, who sat rigidly, his gaze fixed on the floor. She didn't expect an apology. She knew it would be empty, but she wasn't going to let him off without making her point clear. Caleb, she said, her voice firm, you had a choice that day. You could have done your job, checked the facts, treated me fairly. Instead, you acted on your biases, assuming I was guilty just because of how I looked. You thought you could escalate things because you believed you had the power to do so, and now you're facing the consequences of that decision. Olivia's voice was unwavering. Caleb's gaze finally shifted upward, his face drained and his mouth opened, as if trying to find words, but none came. He just stared at her, resentment simmering in his eyes. Olivia wasn't waiting for him to speak. The point had already been made, and the weight of her words hung thick in the room. Chief Nathaniel Brooks broke the silence. Officer Caleb, you are dismissed. Gather your belongings and leave. Caleb stood up slowly, his body rigid, and walked out of the room without uttering another word. The door clicked shut behind him, and the tension in the room seemed to ease slightly, though Olivia still felt the weight of the moment. She turned toward the chief. I'll be keeping a close watch on this, she said. It's good to see the department is taking steps, but I will ensure that this isn't a short-term fix. There's much more to be done. Chief Nathaniel Brooks nodded in understanding. I agree, Miss Chambers. We all want real justice and accountability. With that, Olivia stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Mark rose beside her, and they made their way to the door. Before leaving, Olivia paused and looked back at the chief. I hope you're serious about this, she said softly but firmly. This is just one officer, one incident. The system is still broken, and it'll take more than a single firing to fix it. Chief Nathaniel Brooks gave a solemn nod, acknowledging the weight of her words. I give you my word, Miss Chambers. We are committed to change. Olivia didn't respond. She and Mark exited the station, the early morning light casting long shadows on the streets ahead. The victory was real, but it was just the beginning of a much larger fight. There was still a long road ahead, but for now she allowed herself a quiet moment of satisfaction. Officer Caleb Foster was gone, and the system that had shielded him was now being forced to confront its failures. It wasn't everything, but it was a start, and that was worth fighting for. A week had passed since Caleb's termination, but Olivia still felt the weight of the situation. Sitting in her office, looking out at the city below, the noise of the world seemed distant. The battle against Caleb's misconduct was over, but it didn't bring the sense of triumph she expected. The system that enabled his actions was still standing. Olivia knew she couldn't stop until real change was on the horizon. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Chief Nathaniel Brooks. She answered calmly, bracing for what was next. Miss Chambers, it's Chief Nathaniel Brooks, he said. I wanted to update you on the reforms we've implemented. We've begun new training programs, and consultants are helping us address racial profiling and de-escalation tactics. I'd like to offer you a seat on the oversight committee to ensure the changes stay on track. Olivia considered his words carefully. I appreciate the offer, Chief. It's a step forward, but I hope it's more than just for appearances. Nathaniel paused, then replied, I assure you, Miss Chambers, this is more than just a show. We are committed to real change, and your perspective would be invaluable. Olivia took a moment before responding. I'll think about it, she said. But if I join, it's to make sure real progress is made, not just to look good on paper. Chief Nathaniel Brooks agreed. We welcome your participation whenever you're ready. And again, I apologize for what happened. There's a lot of work ahead. Olivia ended the call and placed the phone on her desk. Nathaniel's words seemed sincere, but she couldn't shake the doubt that lingered from years of seeing promises unfulfilled. Too many reform initiatives had started with good intentions, only to stall when it mattered most. She rose from her chair and paced slowly by the window, the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on her shoulders. Caleb's firing was a necessary step, but the fight for real change was far from over. Caleb was just one man in a system that had failed so many, including her. She thought of the countless others, their voices silenced, their suffering unnoticed because they didn't have the leverage to speak out. As she reflected on the community meetings she'd started organizing, she realized that they were growing bit by bit. More people were stepping forward, sharing their experiences of injustice. It was evident now, Caleb wasn't a rare case. He was a byproduct of a much larger problem, and this was where the real work needed to be done. Her concentration broke with a knock at the door. Mark Edwards entered, calm but perceptive. He didn't need to ask how she was, he could see it in her eyes. I got your message, he said, settling into the chair across from her. How's it going? Olivia exhaled slowly. Chief Nathaniel Brooks reached out. They're implementing reforms, and he wants me to join the oversight committee. Mark's eyebrow arched. Are you going to do it? She hesitated, leaning back in her chair. I don't know. A part of me wants to ensure they're not just making promises for the cameras, but I'm also exhausted. I'm tired of hearing the same things over and over, tired of fighting the same battles. Mark leaned forward slightly. You know this isn't going to be easy, but you're in a unique position, Olivia. You have a chance to make them answer to you. Not everyone has that. Olivia stared out the window, thinking hard. I know, but I don't want to be just another voice in the room, nodding along. I want action. Real, measurable change. Mark's voice was steady. Then make it happen. Be the one who asks the tough questions. You've already made a mark. This is just the start. She was quiet for a moment, reflecting on the community forums she'd been organizing. The stories she'd heard were heartbreaking, but they weren't just her struggles. They were the struggles of so many others. Stories buried by a system designed to ignore them. It wasn't just about her anymore. I've started organizing forums, Olivia said. People are coming forward now. Their stories mirror mine. But they don't have the platform I do. If I take this committee seat, I'm bringing their voices with me. This can't just be about me. Mark smiled, his expression one of quiet confidence. Then you should do it. You're the one who can make sure those voices are heard. Olivia nodded, a sense of clarity washing over her. The exhaustion might have been overwhelming, but she couldn't let it stop her. Too many people were depending on her to keep pushing, whether they knew it or not. The work wasn't just about one officer or one case. It was about dismantling a system that had been broken for far too long. She picked up her phone, quickly typing a message to Chief Nathaniel Brooks. I'll take the seat, but know this. I'm bringing the community with me. We're not here for anything less than real change. As she hit send, a new sense of determination took root within her. The road ahead would be challenging, but she had never been one to shy away from a fight. Mark stood, sensing her resolve. You're doing the right thing, Olivia, and I'll be here with you every step of the way. Olivia met his gaze, grateful for his support. Thanks, Mark. I'm going to need it. When Mark left, she sat back at her desk, her mind sharp and focused. The victories of the past week mattered, but they were just the beginning. The system wouldn't change overnight, but it would change, piece by piece, case by case. Olivia let her thoughts settle on the task ahead. She had taken the first step, and there was no turning back. The fight for justice, for true accountability, was far from finished, but Olivia Chambers was ready. As evening descended, a quiet sense of satisfaction settled over her. She had taken on the system, and now she was a part of the force that would change it. Justice, for the first time in a long time, felt like something she could actually reach.